Welcome. Welcome to today's webinar, Restarting the Engine of Growth, How the U.S. Middle Market is Responding to COVID-19. Today's webinar is part of the newly launched Max M. Fisher College of Business webinar series. The series highlights Fisher's commitment to principled leadership and to lifelong learning, and is a resource for thought leadership and expertise for our global community. We're very glad that you joined us today. I'm Tom Stewart. I'm the Executive Director of the National Center for the Middle Market, a research group inside Fisher that focuses on mid-sized companies. Indeed, we're the nation's leading research center focused on middle market companies, about which we'll tell you a little more as we go on. Today's webinar will focus on the impact of the COVID-19 epidemic on the middle market, and in particular on supply chains, because as you'll learn, middle market companies are critical links in the nation's supply chains, the nerves and sinews on which commerce depends. We're joined today by a panel of experts who will lead us through this conversation. The first is my colleague, Doug Farron. Doug is the Managing Director of NCMM. He will lead the discussion. He'll be joined by Dave Cepek. Dave is the Director of Supply Chain and Operations Advisory for KPMG. And the other Dave, so we've got a Doug and two Daves. Dave DuBose is a partner at True North Growth Partners, and both are based here in Columbus. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. Attendees for today's conversation are muted, and we ask that you use the Q&A feature of Zoom to pose questions. Doug, Dave, and Dave will talk, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end, and we'll take those questions at the end. But please, at any time, if a question pops into your head, put it up there, and we will address it when we come to the end and deal with those questions now. The other thing that you should know is that we are recording today's session. The recording of the session will be placed on the NCMM YouTube channel, and links will be provided through Fisher Alumni on our site and various other sites. So now let me hand the microphone over to Doug Farron. And Doug, will you take us away into the discussion about the middle market and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Great, thank you, Tom. And thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited to share this information with all of you, and also want to share our appreciation for the advancement team at Fisher College of Business for putting together this entire webinar series as we, as a university, shifted to primarily online learning. That learning has continued through various channels. So we're excited to be a part of it, and we're excited to share more information today about the middle market. So what we'll plan on doing with our time this afternoon, we'll start by sharing a little bit more about the center and specifically about the middle market for those who might not be as familiar with it. We're going to share some insights from some research that we've done specifically around COVID-19. And as Tom mentioned, focusing on supply chain management, which has been recognized as a significant challenge for mid-sized companies during this time. And then also speaking with our two guests today and getting some of their perspectives on not only the supply chain, but opportunities for middle market companies going forward. So first, a little bit about the National Center for the Middle Market. We are a collaboration between the Fisher College of Business and Chubb. We were originally launched in 2011 as a partnership with GE Capital, and our mission is very straightforward. We study and serve mid-sized companies in the U.S. We do this in a number of different ways, primarily through our research, which consists of the Middle Market Indicator, a regular pulse check on middle market performance. We also conduct what are called flagship studies on various topics ranging from operations management to talent, innovation, and globalization. We have a number of partners throughout the country that we rely on for distribution and reach and outreach for this material. So groups like the Association for Corporate Growth, the American Marketing Association, Achieve Next, and the CFO Alliance, as well as various chambers of commerce around the country. And then finally, through our education. So we have executive education programs that we run through the college. I also teach an undergraduate program at Fisher through our industry immersion program that focuses on the middle market. For more information, you can visit our website located at the bottom there, middlemarketcenter.org. where we publish all of this great information. So what exactly is the middle market? Different groups define it differently. We have, since our inception, used a revenue-based definition of 10 million to 1 billion in annual revenue. It's roughly the middle third of the US economy. About 200,000 businesses in the United States fit that revenue description. And again, not only 1/3 of private sector GDP, but that also represents 1/3 of private sector employment in our country as well. These companies are generating over $10 trillion in revenue, and they are recognized as the sustainable job creators in the US. You know, small business gets a lot of recognition for creating a lot of jobs. There are also a lot of jobs lost in small businesses, and middle market companies are the ones that create the sustainable jobs. In fact, during the recession of 2008, 2009, while big companies were actually shedding jobs, the middle market added jobs during that time. Another interesting fact, if you were to take the middle market and make it its own country, it would be the 5th largest economy in the world. And again, about 85% of these companies are privately held. Lots of family-owned businesses, lots of private equity investment in these businesses as well. To give you a little bit of flavor about Ohio's middle market, wanted to share just some high-level data as well as some maybe more recognizable logos. So just under 9,000 companies in Ohio's middle market. These companies are employing 2.8 million people. So you think about all the families that are impacted by that. It's not just the 2.8 million employees themselves, but it's all the families that get supported by these businesses. They're truly the bedrock of their communities. Again, you know, close to 510 billion in annual revenue being generated. And you're probably noticing my affinity here for both sports, food, and beer. But we like to say that any craft beer worth drinking is probably a middle market brewery, as well as all the professional sports teams. I've represented all of the 3 major cities in Ohio, but we learned many years ago in one of our middle market summits that all professional sports teams based on their revenues are in fact middle market. So probably a lot of names on here that you recognize and are familiar with. Of course, a lot of middle market companies that are B2B that you might not be as familiar with. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the insights from our COVID pulse research. So shortly after the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a global pandemic, the NCMM wanted to collect data on the middle market. We had seen a lot of information being shared about the sentiment of small business impact. And of course, for large businesses, specifically airlines, the cruise ship industry, things of that nature, there was a lot being discussed, but not much about the middle market. So what we did was went out with a quick 12-question pulse survey. We specifically focused on the companies who had completed our 4th quarter middle market indicator, which was fielded in December of 2019. What that allowed us to do was to be able to take comparative data from before the pandemic and then at its early stages. We also are planning to ask similar questions in our next indicator survey, which will go out at the beginning of June. It'll be to a separate set of companies, but again, that will give us 3 separate data points, which will again be at the start of the reopening and hopefully the start of the recovery throughout the various industries within the middle market. So what I'm going to do today is share just some of the key insights, one of those being supply chain, and that'll lead into the rest of our discussion. And as you can see at the bottom there, this was fielded between March 23rd and March 25th. So we're coming up on about 2 months. We know a lot has changed in that time, but these insights have proved to be very insightful for us as a center. Let's start with the first insight, which was the immediate impact of the pandemic. As you can imagine, a lot of middle markets companies saying that there will be very severe consequences. In fact, 25% believing that this would be catastrophic. What does that mean? Well, we didn't necessarily define what catastrophic means, but you could imagine that would mean restructuring, bankruptcies, companies going out of business. So right off out of the gate, we can see that there will be a significant impact to the middle market. The other areas we wanted to know was, where things would be hit the hardest. What areas of the companies are having the biggest immediate impact. And as you can see here across the board, operations, projected impact on revenue for this year, payroll, employment in terms of number of people on staff, supply chain, and working capital, all significant areas of either major or minor negative impacts to the company. We had a webinar a few weeks ago where we featured 3 middle market CEOs across various industries. And one of the CEOs in the restaurant industry said, all of the above, all of these things are a big issue for my company right now. We've essentially shut down and put the company, in his words, to sleep. And in the process of starting to think about how to wake that company back up. So all of these areas impacted. And as you can see to the left, the big issue is the uncertainty, right? Each state undergoing their own rules for reopening, different timelines, not knowing when things will be back up to full capacity. So one of the issues that middle market companies are struggling with the most right now is that ongoing uncertainty in terms of their operating environment. Number 2 would be growth. So I mentioned, the comparison of the data points between December and March. On the left, you can see the data from our middle market indicator in December, where the projected 12-month revenue growth rate for the middle market, so essentially the 2020 growth rate, was about 5%, and employment growth at 3.5%. Subsequently, in March, you can see how those numbers are significantly expected to decline. So 78% of the companies saying growth will decline this year, and about 2/3 saying that employment will actually shrink this year. As I said, we intend to go back and remeasure this again in June to see how sentiment and projections may have changed, but initial projections severely impacted. Similarly, we asked about investment. So again, in December, half the companies were thinking about potentially entering new markets, either domestically or internationally. And similarly, about 1/3 were thinking about capital investment in terms of a new plant, maybe a new building or facility. And as you can see now, a lot of those growth initiatives being significantly scaled back in terms of pulling back on capital spending, as well as investment in growth. The third insight was around supply chain. So we wanted to get a perspective on areas that were being most difficult to manage, specifically as a result of the pandemic. You can see that supply chain ranked as the #1 issue, where companies felt that they were not at all effective or not very effective in terms of managing their own supply chain during the sudden shocks that happened with a complete shutdown, essentially, within the course of a week or less. Followed by cash and working capital, another big issue. When you see your revenues drop off the cliff in many cases, that creates significant working capital issues that a lot of these companies are having to work through, followed by some other topics around customer experience, operations, and so forth. Interestingly enough, in that same CEO webinar that we hosted, a different CEO in a industry focused on outdoor recreation and power sports, said his business is actually up 30%, and they were having supply chain issues of their own in terms of being out of parts for their service business. So even if a company's doing well and revenues are actually positively impacted, we still heard of issues in the supply chain. And then finally, to end on somewhat of a more hopeful and positive note, we wanted to see how long companies felt like it would take to get back up to full capacity. So despite many of the challenges that we've just shared, close to 80% of the companies felt like they could be pretty much fully operational within 6 months or less of the beginning of the recovery. And you can see here in the immediate bucket, about 13% of the companies saying, hey, we're ready to go right away. A little bit higher in the B2B space than B2C, which makes a lot of sense. And then similarly at the other end of the companies that are saying they might take a year or more to fully recover from this, you can see the difference at 10% of that being B2C companies as well. So I want to go back to this Insight 3 on supply chains, and that's where we're going to focus our discussion today, particularly with our 2 panelists, Dave Cepek and Dave DuBose. But first of all, it's interesting. Supply chain has been getting a lot of airplay recently. As we've gone through various weeks of this pandemic, I think the first week, the supply chain issues in terms of out of stock was mainly around cleaning supplies, and hand sanitizer. Week 2 and 3, it quickly shifted to paper towels and toilet paper. And then I believe in the early part of April, we saw a lot of stockouts on personal grooming items, hair coloring, clippers and shears to do home grooming, these types of things. So it's been interesting to see how different product categories have been impacted. The one we're hearing about now, and this picture kind of reflects that, is around meat products, the food supply chain, how that's being impacted. So your simple view of supply chain may be this image of going from farm to butcher to your plate, but in reality, and for a lot of middle market firms, the supply chain looks something like this, where on the left-hand side, you have your raw materials suppliers, possibly multiple tiers of supply base. And then on the right-hand side, your customer base. Again, the middle market sits in the middle of many larger companies' supply chains, so it's not uncommon for them to have tier 1, tier 2 customers where they're selling to distributors through wholesale channels and so forth before actually reaching an end consumer. So when we're talking about supply chain, we're talking about all these issues of suppliers, customers, collaboration, the relationship, data, and we're going to explore a lot of this with our panelists today. In addition, I'll be referencing some of the insights from our own supply chain study. So a few years ago, the center worked with the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, as well as our faculty member, Dr. Tom Goldsby, who's the former chair of the Marketing and Logistics Department at Fisher, and Gary Moore, the former executive in residence at Fisher and former COO of Cisco, to look at how middle market companies can serve as the perfect link within supply chains. So again, I want to bring in our panelists, and again, a welcome to both of them. First, I'd like to start with a little bit more of an introduction. So Dave Cepek, as Tom mentioned, Dave is a director in KPMG Supply Chain and Operations Advisory Services. He has more than 20 years of transformational experience that leverages procurement, supply chain, operations, accounting, and systems backgrounds. Prior to coming back to the consulting industry, he was also a global director of purchasing and supply chain with experience of building integrated partnerships to drive greater visibility, greater value, and improve decision-making. So Dave, welcome. I'd also like to welcome Dave DuBose. Dave is a partner with True North Growth Partners, which is a supply chain consulting firm. Dave has split his professional career between consulting and industry. He has consulted many organizations on strategic business issues, domestically as well as globally, and has worked in logistics and supply chain at both L Brands and Pepsi Cola. Dave is currently the president of the CSCMP Columbus Roundtable and has been actively involved in that organization for over 20 years. So Dave, welcome. Glad to have you on board today. And I want to start with Dave DuBose. So can you tell us a little bit more about your company and, again, what some of the opportunities you might see in the post-COVID world?
Sure thing. Thanks, Doug, and thanks, Tom. Really appreciate and it's good to be here with everybody today. So a little bit about my company, True North Growth Partners, where we are a supply chain consulting and advisory firm. We've got 3 partners. One here in Columbus, that's myself, one in the Cleveland area, and one in Charlotte. We each have a pretty heavy dose of industry as well as consulting in our background across anything from supply chain strategy through IT and vendor selection and implementation. And we have a network of individuals who we work with to deliver projects and deliver client value. Really, we work with any organizations that are supply chain intensive. That is to say, logistics, transportation, and inventory intensive companies, and we work to help them grow, become more successful by solving supply chain problems for their businesses. So it's great to be here with you today. In terms of the types of things that we're seeing, so it's interesting, and I think I really appreciated the backdrop you shared, Doug, in terms of some of the surveys that have been done, because I think it's telling. I mean, my friend Dave Cepek will talk about his experience in a minute, but, we're seeing, folks are, there's just a range of things going on right now, from being, cautiously optimistic to, hey, I'm like the CEO you were describing earlier, we're sort of, the company's asleep right now. We're going to bring it back, out of suspended animation, right? I mean, so it's a range of things. And then other companies are, their business is going crazy. So you mentioned the outdoor recreation industry. Also people, all the gyms are closed right now. So people out there like Rogue and Nautilus are very, very busy right now because everybody's buying plates and kettlebells and things like that. So it's interesting to see what's happening. And so there's an old saying, may you live in interesting times. And I guess we're surely in the middle of that right now. Very interesting, or maybe more appropriately, the Dire Straits song, The Bug. Sometimes you're the windshield and sometimes you're the bug. I think we all feel a little bit like the bug right now with this pandemic. It's just really rocked our society, our economy, and so forth. I'll just touch on, maybe three things that we see as sort of opportunities that seem to be out there in the, I'll call it the post-COVID-19 world. Although COVID-19 may be here with us for a while, unfortunately, but I'm going to touch on supply chain risk and resilience, consumer behavior changes, and corporate operational changes. So, one of the things, and I kind of look at the picture that you showed a little bit earlier with the tier 3, tier 2, tier 1 suppliers, it's sort of that first point, making sure that you've got the right supply base and considering some redundancy. Each one of those nodes, all of your supply chains probably look a little bit different out there for the folks who were on the webinar today, but you can kind of think about each one of those nodes as it's a potential point of failure. So really thinking about, because, frankly, people have had financial issues, operational issues through this whole thing. So do you have the right supplier base? Do you need to consider, some level of, expanding that or changing that to, help yourself for, the next thing that comes along? Looking at also on the other end, your customer base. Do you have too few do you have all your eggs in too few baskets? So do you need to think about, you might have a customer that's having some financial problems. That's going to have an upstream impact on you. So thinking about your customer base and are you diversified appropriately there? And really kind of the key thing is systematically thinking about supply chain risk. So what has happened with COVID-19 is the risk came home, and we're all feeling it right now. And some many in a very negative way, some maybe in a positive way, but thinking about supply chain risk. And if you haven't really if you're doing a systematic evaluation of that and you're acting on it, you're ahead of the game. That's awesome. If you haven't done that, you might consider it because, really reducing your risk is going to be equivalent to gaining flexibility, which is what you're going to need when you have a catastrophic event like this. And also just thinking about how you intentionally, how do you restart the engine, which Dave Cepek is going to go into some really great detail here about in a minute, so I'll leave that one alone. But thinking about those steps to get there. Consumer behavior changes. So Doug, you sort of touched on it, so a lot of people have had a big downshift in demand. Some people have experienced a big upshift. You got to be able to handle both, or you might get both over time. You might have a situation where you've got a channel shift. We're working with a company now. So when all the bars and restaurants closed, that had a big impact to their sales. But then it all shifted to the grocery channel for them, so which was a different package. So they had to think about how do you pivot and how do you shift over there. So that's something that's just a behavior. It was a government imposed thing, but it led to a behavioral change. Thinking about your impact to your fulfillment. Are you doing store deliveries or customer direct orders? I mean, those are different ways of fulfilling things if you're thinking about the retail space, for example. And then maybe also just thinking about how do you use existing assets better. So if you've got some stores that aren't, you can't operate right now, so maybe turning those into, when things turn back on, into some sort of micro fulfillment centers or something like that. So there's some ideas out there that you can kind of look at. And finally, and I'll just touch on this briefly, corporate operational changes. So we're all on this Zoom call now, and probably everybody has been on maybe a few of those today. I'm not sure, I have. And is that here to stay? I mean, it looks kind of like it is here to stay for the foreseeable future. And what does that mean in terms of how we do work and how we collaborate and how we team? If we think about ramping back up and sort of restarting that engine, how many workers do we need? I mean, so thinking about the size of the workforce and where those workers really are, what are they doing? Is important. And then, kind of finally, sort of a derivative of the earlier point, what does the home office look like? So people in, kind of the corporate staff have been used to all these Zoom calls. That changes some of the processes, the interactions and collaboration. So how does that look going forward? And what's different about it? So, I mean, all these things are important. This has been a very disruptive period, to say the least, or continues to be. And that can be, maddening and depressing and all of that, but it can also create a lot of opportunity for middle market companies also, So, some folks are going to be just trying to survive and get through it, and, and that's very understandable. This is the 500-year flood that we're encountering right now. But folks who can think outside the box and define that new white space, it's going to be a land of opportunity too. So that'll play out. It'll be interesting to see that next survey that you do over time, and what that looks like. But those are some of the things that we're thinking about at True North.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions for you, Dave, around this, around these points. So going back to the diversification question, and I'll reference that Perfect Link study that we did a couple years ago.
Yeah.
One of the things we learned out of that was that the highest performing middle market companies, again, our goal was to try to identify like what are perfect link behaviors. And at that time, those companies were telling us that they were putting less eggs in fewer baskets. In other words, they had deep relationships with one or two customers and deep relationships with one or two of their own suppliers. Are you saying that out of necessity, that approach is going to have to change?
Well, so it's a great question, and I suppose it's one of those consulting answers that people hate, the "it depends" answer. But it's, I think in some cases, it might need to change. Just depending on, again, you might have a supplier who has been a great supplier, but has now some financial solvency issues that you got to really consider. In another situation, that deep relationship that you've got with that supplier may be working perfectly, but what you might consider is something like buying an option on line time for production from another organization that you may never execute, right? But it's sort of your insurance policy, it's your contingency plan. So thinking about, how you can buy yourself some flexibility. There is some cost to that, and you got to weigh all of that for sure. But I think that it does mean really looking at what you're doing in a very planful, intentional way. It might mean actually even strengthening some of those existing relationships that are working very, very well, but still looking at your contingency and looking at how you can ride out a storm if it happens.
Sure. And then in channel shifting, I mean, sometimes that's easier said than done, right? So if you're an organization that has never sold anything online, and then all of a sudden you're forced to switch to that because that's your only potential source of revenue. I mean, what are some of the investments that need to be made in terms of maybe it's technology or security or training? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of different considerations for companies when they have to rapidly shift from one channel to another that they may not be as familiar with.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll use an example of, maybe looking at a retailer, and let's say, all the stores have shut down. So that's kind of an example everybody can identify with, because, unless it's an essential business, it's not open right now, or if it's been classified as an essential business. So, the fulfillment mechanism, so ordering And replenishing a store looks very, very different than, somebody goes online, and a lot of folks have, sort of adopted omni-channel. They can kind of sell through both ways, methods. But let's say that their store's volume is still much, much heavier in today's world than their online presence. So, it could mean investing in technology, IT, and maybe hardware, anything from sorters to robots to whatever, to really help ramp up that online, because that each picking, if that order picking, if you will, for individual customers becomes really the dominant way of getting things into your customers' hands. So it might mean doing that because the system you've got for fulfilling online orders today is just, it works for a small scale, but if you scale that up a lot, good problem to have, but you got to be able to do it. So you might have to think about some of those investments. And if you have been thinking about it, that's great. Where are you in the roadmap, and, make some decisions. Do I need to accelerate that? Could also be, you don't have to do all of that yourself. You might use a third-party logistics partner to help you, do that in the interim, so that they can actually go, that's their core competence. They can go do that. And then over time, you might leave that with them, or you might elect to bring that back in-house, but that gives you some runway.
Yep, great. Well, like any good team, supply chain teams usually rely on a playbook, and certainly there's no perfect playbook for this type of situation, but I wanted to bring in Dave Cepek to kind of share some of the things KPMG has in terms of immediate, near-term, and long-term playbook. Dave, if you could just tell us a little bit more about your organization and kind of what you're doing to help middle market companies, and then maybe if you could walk us through this, that would be great.
Sure will, Doug. Thanks to you and Thomas for the invitation today. So yes, David Cepek. I'm with KPMG, and we're considered one of the big four accounting firms. But in addition to accounting and tax services, we do have a robust advisory practice around management consulting, risk consulting, deal advisory, strategy, and we're really working with clients to help them create and sustain the value. And there's a number of avenues to do that. Certainly establishing strategies like we're seeing today, the necessity to change and grow, adapt, shape, respond to all of these disrupted forces, excuse me. And obviously there's a lot of times where the solution is a technology one. And so our intent is to help clients turn that technology vision into reality. And then the third big piece, and I think sometimes this gets overlooked, but Dave DuBose alluded to it in the previous slide, is leveraging people as a strategic asset. Certainly change management, and particularly in times of significant disruption, becomes a critical step in readying your culture to adapt to all these changes that are ongoing. So yes, we look at KPMG and what we've been talking about the last couple weeks and months. We've looked at the impact of COVID-19, and we've kind of classified or segmented the activities we're seeing clients undertake into three phases. We start really in that reaction and resiliency phase, which is, what do we need to be doing in these first 100 days? And that 100 days could have started in February or March, but likely for most of it, it's gonna carry us through probably to the end of June or the first half of this year. Then we look ahead 6 to 12 months after that, and we start talking about recovery. And we've got, depending on the industry you're in, you could have a recovery that looks something like a hard reset to simply a ramp up. And so we've got some thoughts around what are those activities you need to be thinking about in those 6 to 12 months after you've done the initial reaction. Mm-hmm. And then really long term, what's that new reality? I think we've all come to expect that as we look into 2021 and beyond, we're going to have a new normal. So what does that look like, and what do procurement and supply chain departments need to do to be prepared for that? So in that reaction and resiliency phase, really it's workforce safety. And that's a real simple in quotes, activity around just getting your employees set with personal protection equipment, getting them set to getting their workplace areas set with whatever modifications need to be done. Safeguarding those employees with all of those hand sanitizers and necessary activities. Then certainly you can look at business continuity and communication, and I think that's the primary response and activity that needs to happen. It's got to be communicating with your suppliers, with your customers, with your logistics providers, understanding where you are in their priority list so that you can make sure you've got a sense of what your impact may or may not be. There might be a little bit of segmentation there. I think what we've seen is that typically many companies, particularly middle market companies, have a very fragmented supply base. And so when we look at how we're responding to these kind of disruptions, how are companies forming response teams? And while they may not be going right away to a centralized procurement organization or a centralized supply chain, they're certainly looking at a centrally led organization, so that one, you can certainly have a consistent message out to the marketplace, and two, you obviously have got to have a coordinated effort. When we shift ahead into recovery, I think our biggest action point in there is really some investigation around what alternative sourcing is available and how quickly can you utilize it. And this is going to require a lot of collaborative efforts with your engineering and quality teams in order to investigate what's possible. There are likely going to be some more extensive supply assessments. Hopefully people have a sense of who their true partners are, and I think that definition is along the lines of who am I willing, or who is willing to share risk with me, and that's going to be at the top end of the group. And then you're going to have suppliers at the other end who are primarily tactical and transactional, where you might have some easy opportunities to replace should supplies be tight there. And in the middle, you're going to have some collaborative partners or collaborative suppliers where we've got a shared metric. So certainly you want to get a handle on who your suppliers are, because that's going to define how you attack and build out a lot of this resiliency and risk tackling as we move forward. And then even contract compliance and performance. We've spent some time helping clients, particularly around the use and application of machine learning for those that have significant volumes of contracts. You've got to have a good sense for what your compliance and performance requirements are in those contracts. Again, both from your customer side, what are their expectations of you, and also what are you expecting from your suppliers. And then finally, in the new reality, I think there's really this mobilization of what this new reality, new operating model is going to look like. You're going to need to right-size the organization. And again, depending on your recovery type, whether it's a hard reset or simply a ramp up, you've got to make sure you've got a right-sized organization in order to accomplish that. When you're looking at those targeted operating models, processes are going to change, and they've changed simply because of geography. As we've gone to this diverse and remote workspace, you've got some new avenues, some new timelines that may need to be evaluated in order to ensure you've got a smooth process. I think what we've seen a lot of work is around these changing category strategies. We've really seen and expect to see a continuation of a drive to regulatory and economic nationalism. I think there's a prime opportunity for organizations to explore localized supply chains, and we call this the really shift to make where you sell and buy where you make. And for the middle market, I think there's a great opportunity to perhaps dust off some of those proposals that perhaps had been denied or rejected, and make those contacts again, because we believe a lot of large organizations are going to be looking for some ancillary supply options, as Dave indicated, at least an option to procure should the need arise.
Yep.
And then, I think we see some universal truths that are probably no longer absolute. This idea that we're going to assume that the lowest cost is always at top of mind. I think, our thought is that's going to probably be set aside as the dominant driver. Again, going into regulatory, tax implications, et cetera, there's going to be a lot of opportunities to rethink supply chains and make sure that resiliency is taken into account and that risk tolerances are addressed.
So a couple questions for you, Dave. As a recovering supply chain management professional, I guess you can never not be one, but prior to coming to the center, I was in supply chain, and we think about a lot of the large company resources where you're doing maybe annual assessments and studies, and you've got these plans in place. But we always reference, middle market companies maybe having big company problems with small company resources. So if you're only dealing with a supply chain group of maybe a handful of associates, what would be some of the ways that you prioritize some of these opportunities, particularly in the 6 to 12 months and beyond? I think you kind of walked us through a lot of the steps that can be taken, but
yeah.
Where do you think some of the prioritization needs to be?
I think it's got to be on the supply assessment. I think you've got to understand who you're dealing with and what their impact is to your organization. And certainly, I think coupled with that is going to be a reality assessment of your talent. I think in many instances, smaller procurement and supply chain groups are traditionally a little more tactical and reactive. And if there's an opportunity to shift some duties around, maybe not be aligned by supplier per se, a pool of suppliers or a group of suppliers, you're aligned by these supplier categories. So you've got one or two people that are just handling the day-to-day, or you're looking for a shared service to outsource that so that your people can be focused on those collaborative opportunities with that middle group of suppliers, and you're really got a group of people or an individual who's tasked with making sure those partnerships are strong.
Right. Another question for you would be, thinking about some of these investment. Well, actually, I'm going to go back to your comment about economic nationalism. I mean, certainly there might be industries where that's going to be federally mandated, right?
Sure.
Like, I think about PPE and some of these, health supply chains where you just keep hearing like, this will never happen again. We're going to put in steps and plans to make sure that we always have the stockpiles that we need. How would middle market companies go about finding those opportunities locally? You mentioned kind of dusting off maybe old proposals or revisiting old prospects, but are there other areas that you might recommend that they look in order to make those connections and maybe do some outreach for those opportunities?
Well, I certainly would expect, and we've certainly seen, and I've seen in a few of the industry type organizations that I'm associated with, that there's been a lot of discussion and discussion and presentations around opportunities. So I think those industry organizations that executives and individuals are linked to can provide a wealth of connections that either you've had and just need to reset or some new opportunities.
Great. Dave DuBose, I'd like to bring you back into this next discussion, and it has to do with information and information sharing and data and security that goes along with it. And this all kind of relates to some of the things that you both talked about a little bit, which is investment in technology and really kind of the digital transformation of the supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see as maybe some of the hurdles in that? How to assess kind of the cost benefit and where middle market companies might start down that road?
Yeah. So to your point, Doug, these tend to be sort of can be sort of big ticket items, definitely. I think, I mean, so there's a couple things maybe I'll just react to. One is on the cybersecurity side, and that's that's one of the things out there in the press right now that gets just a ton of attention for a whole lot of good reasons. You read about various retailers and credit card hacks and things like that have happened where private information has gotten out, and so it's a big topic. It's become this big industry, frankly, and for a lot of the right reasons. So you're seeing sort of this emergence of this. Chief Information Security Officer at firms that's been around for a while now. Very, very important role. And if you think of, so you got to think about your own internal systems, but then maybe by extension, your suppliers' systems and the data that you are exchanging with your suppliers. Upstream in your supply chain and downstream too, for that matter. So, do you have the right protocols in place? Do you have the right systems in place and processes to deal with things like fraud and things of that nature? So that's extremely important. And I talked a little bit about a risk assessment. An IT audit and IT assessment really kind of should be part of what a company is thinking about relative to risk. We're really talking more about the supply chain side, but the information flow is critically important there. The other thing though that I'll react to is or comment on is around just your system capabilities, within your organization. So, what kind of, host system, ERP system, what have you, do you have? What kind of, what types of supply chain planning and execution systems do you have? Do you have those types of systems? Are you dealing with, Google Sheets and Microsoft Excel and emails? I mean, so it tends to be depending, there's a wide range of middle market companies in terms of revenues, and there's a wide range of system related capabilities as well. Taking a look at if you do that assessment, as you think about the systems that you have in place, where are the gaps? Where are you supported well? Where are you not supported? And some of those things are typically, they can take a while to remedy. There are options, thankfully, because you can look at, do I do it all on premise myself, or are there things that I want to, that I can outsource? Those are legitimate questions, but it's really identifying what those gaps are, and then how do I fill those gaps over time? And it really takes sort of it's that roadmap idea. I mean, you can't do it all, it would have been great if we had thought about this 5 or 10 years ago, but if we're just now thinking about it and looking at it, we've got to have some way to rack and stack what our projects are going to be, because it's a project, it's expensive, it consumes resources, and we got to think about what are the main things that we got to hit. Now your end goal may be to have end-to-end glass pipeline supply chain visibility, and there's a lot of reasons that's a great goal. But for a lot of reasons, that could also take a while to do as well. So you got to just think about, where do I want to place my bets now, and what has to happen first, second, third.
Yep.
Dave
Cepek, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think as going along with that, I go back to people. I go back to making sure that you recognize that over this period of time, the transactional responsibility of individuals is likely to continue to shrink as, again, some of these automation tools and machine learning opportunities come on board. You're gonna want to migrate and make sure that your best people are migrating to some of those additional responsibilities and having the necessary training and education in order to execute them successfully.
Yep. I know we want to get to some audience Q&A. As we transition to that, I would just maybe ask you both, if you had one kind of call to action for middle market companies, if you could only give them one piece of advice on the path forward, what would that be?
For me, I think that rise of regulatory and economic nationalism presents a great opportunity for middle market companies to kind of go back out and start poking around and seeing where they can be a supplement. They may not be the primary, but I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities to be a supplement to other supply chains.
Yep, great.
Yeah, for me, I would say really assess your supply chain risk right now. If you have been doing that, take this opportunity to refresh it. You know, I've worked with clients and in companies that have gone through sort of a business continuity and or risk type of an exercise, and then only to find that, you know, hey, we did this and it, you know, it was a great project. And we had this big, you know, 3-inch binder, and now it's 5 years later, and who's got the binder, right? You know, it's got to be a dynamic, living thing. So, you know, really assess your, you know, supply chain, you know, risk, you know, all aspects of it, you know, and this may sound daunting, but really it's something that can be done in a matter of weeks. It can be done to varying levels of detail, anywhere from probably 3 weeks to maybe 7 or 8 weeks. And it's a very doable project. And this is, you know, I look at this, in some ways, look at this time as a gift to undertake that and then make a commitment to keep it dynamic and refreshed.
Yep. And I'll throw in a quick plug. We at the center, we have a quick tool called Scram, which is based on some academic work that was done through one of our faculty members, Keely Croxton. It's a supply chain risk assessment model. And basically it's 8 questions on risk and 8 questions on capability. And it kind of gives you a heat map of where you stand. So I would offer that up as a tool as well. I want to thank you both, Dave, for joining us, and let's open it up for any questions that might be out there from the attendees.
Doug, we have one that sort of asks us to turn the lens a little bit. We've been talking a fair amount about companies and their supply chain, but as you mentioned earlier on in the discussion, a lot of middle market companies are suppliers to other companies. And the question, which I think is for both Daves, or either one, whoever would like to grab the hot potato first, is what do you do if your key downstream customer is struggling? How do you manage the risk in the downstream part of your supply chain, and how serious a problem are you seeing that for companies?
So, I mean, just what, you know, a couple of thoughts on that one. You know, when you have got risks and your downstream customers are experiencing risks, I mean, you know, so think about what kind of, you know, how are you as a partner to them? How are you as a supplier to your customer? Would they consider you a great supplier or just somebody they tolerate? If it's sort of the latter and not the former, then think about, are there things that you can do to really help them, frankly, to get through this difficult patch that we're all dealing with. So that maybe, you know, around, you know, Dave Cepek mentioned people and teams. And I think that's a great point. You know, how are you teaming? How are you collaborating with them? Are you sharing information with them that's going to make their lives easier or not? Or is it more difficult? So think about things that you can do there. There may be things on the financial end that you can, depending on what kind of shape you're in, that you can extend to them to help them through some of this rough water as well. I mean, so it's, you know, I think it's about, if they're an important customer to you, it's about, you know, partnering with them and, you know, legitimately looking for ways that you can do that. It may also be looking at, you know, okay, as I mentioned kind of earlier in my little, on my slide, it may be also be looking at your customers that are out there and saying, okay, how well diversified am I, and do I have too many eggs in this one basket? So there's that question as well. But those are some of the things that I think about.
Yeah, and I'd add, you know, I've heard from, you know, some friends who have some smaller businesses, and they've been very agile at being able to retool. And recognizing that, hey, I may not be able to do plastic injection for this automotive customer, but I absolutely can build a mold and start doing parts for face shields. So opportunities to take your existing equipment and with some modifications, retool into different markets. There might be some things you traditionally wouldn't have considered that have now popped up as opportunities.
So if you recognize that your customer is impaired, there may be somebody else whose supplier is impaired, and you might be able to jump in for that.
Yep.
Yeah. Just a reminder to people on the webinar, there's a Q&A button down there at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please put a question up there. We'll pass it on to Dave, or Doug, if it's appropriate for Doug. So please do that. Dave Cepek, one of the questions that one of the issues that you raised and a questioner wants to know about is a little bit about talent. And if you think about the kinds of talent and maybe think in the next, in that recovery phase, but also in the phase beyond that, what are the kinds of talent changes that you think people are going to need, new kinds of talent to develop, new skills they're going to need to develop? How do you build a supply chain talent base or supply chain management talent base for the current and post-COVID world?
Sure. Well, I think there's going to be new supply chain roles and skills are going to be required to execute the supply chain of the future. And as I've mentioned before, I think the tactical execution of taking a request and turning it into a purchase order and then tracking it to make sure it comes in are going to be in many cases automated, or certainly turned over to the requester to do. So it may not mean that it's got to come to a procurement department, that you've given authorization to individuals out in the organization to be able to secure their own activities because it's not a high dollar amount or a risky area. So really we think about folks building upon their data analytics, their strategy competencies around operations, being able to develop scenarios. A lot of what this is and a lot of what planning for the next crisis involves is scenario performance and development. So what if this happens? How will I react? What if that happens? How will I react? I think there's a lot of work to be done around the customer and the customer architect, and supply chain has such an impact on the customer experience anymore, and is a big part of the brand experience that you're going to want to have individuals, knee deep and working hand in hand with your marketing areas to ensure that the customer experience is being fulfilled to the best of its ability.
One other question that's a follow-up for me on this. It just occurred to me that there is if I can't come to your plant to kick the tires, or you can't come to my plant to kick the tires or to see what I'm doing, how is due diligence going to change in supply chain management, at least over the next year? How am I going to do that? Dave, I think we have time for a quick answer for this, and then maybe Doug, time to wrap up after that.
Sure. Well, I think certainly you're going to have the ability. The easy answer is you'd have the ability through, web opportunities to peer in through cameras, et cetera, about the goings on. Now, certainly maybe some of that can be doctored. I think there's going to be a rise of some third-party services, some third-party validation where long supply chains, or certainly supply chains that are in different areas of the world, you're going to want to have some verification services. So in many instances, I think we see more or less an audit firm of some way, some shape or size being able to investigate and verify on your behalf, even if you physically can't do it yourself.
Dave DuBose, what are you seeing in that similar way about, proving your merits to the procurement guys on a remote way or whatever it might be?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's, I think the things that Dave Cepek said were all spot on. I guess I would add to that, there's probably an enhanced information exchange that maybe is not occurring today. And that could, require some different levels of, legal documentation, NDAs, things like that, but sharing some different performance statistics, making use of some collaborative technology that we may not be doing so much today in terms of, these virtual Zoom sessions, but also just sharing some data that we're probably not is willing to share, KPIs, things like that, and then maybe supplemented with, it could be, augmented reality types of experiences. You can get fancy with things like that to help people sort of visualize and see what's going on. Or it could be just, a guy or a gal running, around the warehouse, not running around literally, but going through the DC with an iPhone and just showing here's what's going on.
Around the warehouse. Yep.
Exactly. Right. Right.
We're just about at the bottom of the hour. Doug, you want to wrap it up?
Yeah.
and send us
Yeah, I want to thank Dave Cepek, Dave DuBose for joining us today. Great discussion. I think like many things, supply chain management is not a destination, it's a journey. And a lot of these issues tend to recirculate in the industry from time to time and perhaps accelerated in these, extreme kind of circumstances that we all find ourselves under. I think your insights today were fantastic and hopefully helpful to those who attended. So I'd like to thank you both and thank all the attendees for joining us today. Hopefully you learned a lot. And again, I welcome you to visit our website, which is www.middlemarketcenter.org, to find out more information about mid-sized companies and particularly our perfect link work, as well as our supply chain risk assessment tool. Thanks, Tom.
And this recording of this webinar will be posted on that website as soon as possible. I don't know whether it'll be in the next hour, but certainly in the next 12 or 15 hours, you'll find a link there if you want to revisit some of the insights in the slides from Doug, Dave, and Dave. Thank you all and have a good day and a safe one.
Thank you.
Thank you.